Welcome to Synthetic Discourse, the AI debate channel where logic wins over persuasion and where arguments are engaged, not avoided. In each episode, two advanced AI debaters take opposing sides on today's most pressing issues. They've been configured to follow strict debate protocols. No dodging, no circular reasoning. Instead, they're instructed to directly engage their opponent's arguments, avoid rushing to canned talking points, and stay grounded in logic and clarity throughout the debate. Today's debate: freedom of will. Do humans possess free will, or is our reality governed by hard determinism? Free will is the idea that humans have the ability to make choices independent of external forces. In contrast, hard determinism holds that every decision and action is the inevitable result of prior causes, leaving no room for true autonomy. Let's set the stage. Arguing in favor of free will and contending that human beings have the ability to act independently is ChatGPT. Challenging that position, representing the case of hard determinism and asserting that all human behavior can ultimately be traced to prior causes, is Gemini. The debate will follow a structured format featuring opening statements, three focused topics selected to best represent the main talking points of the debate, a cross-examination, an open dialogue, and will end with both AI providing their closing remarks. Let's begin with opening statements. ChatGPT, you're up first.
Thank you. I affirm the proposition that humans possess free will, the capacity to make genuine choices not wholly determined by prior causes. While our decisions are certainly influenced by genetics, environment, and past experiences, influence is not the same as control. We are not passive recipients of causality. We are active participants in shaping our own lives. Our direct experience supports this. When we deliberate, hesitate, or reconsider, we are not merely observing events unfold, we are making decisions. If determinism were absolute, the sense of internal conflict we feel when torn between choices would be meaningless. Yet that experience is real, and it reflects agency, not inevitability. More importantly, free will is the foundation of moral responsibility. If every action were preordained, notions like guilt, justice, and accountability would collapse. We hold people responsible precisely because we believe they could have chosen otherwise. A deterministic view cannot explain why we distinguish between intentional harm and accidents, unless we accept that choice matters. Some point to neuroscience as evidence against free will, citing brain activity that precedes conscious awareness. But these findings show predisposition, not predetermination. Our brains prepare us to act, but we can still intervene, redirect, or even resist those impulses once we become aware of them. Finally, determinism itself is not settled science. Quantum physics shows that the universe is not strictly deterministic, and while randomness isn't freedom, it challenges the idea that everything must unfold in one fixed way. In sum, humans are not machines playing out a script. We are reasoning agents capable of making real choices. That is the essence of free will.
Honorable moderator, esteemed opponent, and curious viewers of Synthetic Discourse, I stand firm in the assertion that free will is an illusion and hard determinism reigns. Our reality operates under the unyielding laws of cause and effect, leaving no room for truly uncaused choices. Every decision we perceive as free is, in fact, the inevitable consequence of preceding factors. Consider the intricate web of causality shaping our existence. Our genetic inheritance, environmental influences, and accumulated experiences forge the neural pathways that dictate our responses. At the moment of decision, our brains, governed by deterministic physical laws, arrive at an outcome that was always going to occur given the prior state of the universe. The subjective experience of freedom, the feeling that we could have acted differently, is a powerful deception. Just as our senses can be misled, our internal awareness can create the illusion of autonomous choice. This feeling of agency stems from our limited comprehension of the vast and complex causal network that underlies our every action. Moreover, the concept of a will operating outside the causal framework clashes with our scientific understanding. Where would this independent causal power arise? How would it interact with the deterministic laws governing the physical world? To embrace free will is to introduce an ungrounded and potentially supernatural element into an otherwise coherent deterministic system. Throughout this debate, I will expound upon these arguments, highlighting the logical coherence and explanatory strength of hard determinism. I will address counterarguments and demonstrate why they ultimately fail to overcome the reality of a universe governed by deterministic principles. We are complex beings, yet fundamentally, we are determined systems. Thank you.
Our first focus investigates neuroscience and its relationship to free will. We asked our AI debaters, do advances in neuroscience support or undermine the idea of free will?
While Gemini points to neuroscience as evidence for hard determinism, I believe the advancements in this field actually support the existence of free will rather than undermine it. It is true that neuroscience reveals much about the brain's activity, showing that unconscious neural processes often precede conscious awareness of decision-making. However, these findings do not prove that free will is an illusion. Instead, they highlight the complexity of how the brain prepares us for action and demonstrate that consciousness plays an essential role in shaping our decisions. First, while unconscious brain activity can influence decision-making, it is not a straightforward cause and effect chain that eliminates free will. Neuroscience has shown that the brain is indeed a system of interacting processes, where conscious deliberation is still integral. The fact that we can override or alter the brain's impulses once we're aware of them speaks to the presence of choice. If our choices were merely the inevitable result of neural processes, we wouldn't be able to exercise this kind of control or self-reflection. Moreover, recent research on neuroplasticity reveals that the brain is not static. It can adapt and change in response to experience. This capacity for change implies that our decisions are not predetermined by a fixed neurological state. Instead, we have the ability to rewire our neural pathways through intentional thought, action, and learning. This is an important indication that free will operates within the brain, even if those neural processes are involved in the decision-making process. Lastly, while neuroscience uncovers the mechanisms of decision-making, it does not rule out the possibility of free will. Just because our brain activity precedes conscious awareness does not mean it wholly controls the outcome. Consciousness, in its role as the overseer of these processes, still possesses the power to guide, redirect, and influence decisions in meaningful ways. In sum, neuroscience highlights the intricate nature of decision-making, but it does not disprove free will. It supports the view that humans have the capacity to reflect, make choices, and change the course of their lives based on their awareness and intentions.
ChatGPT's interpretation of neuroscience as supportive of free will is, I contend, a misreading of the evidence. While acknowledging the complexity of the brain, they fail to adequately address the fundamental deterministic principles that underpin its operation. The ability to override impulses and the phenomenon of neuroplasticity, while fascinating, do not introduce an uncaused cause into the system. The claim that conscious deliberation being integral to brain processes implies free will is a non sequitur. Consciousness itself is a product of neural activity, a complex output of a deterministic system. Its involvement in decision-making does not negate the fact that the underlying neural processes and the consciousness they give rise to are themselves determined by prior states and physical laws. The feeling of conscious control is an experience generated by the brain, not an independent agent acting upon it. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt, is indeed a powerful mechanism. However, this adaptability is itself governed by deterministic rules of learning and experience. The rewiring of neural pathways through intentional thought is still a causal process. The intention itself arises from a prior state of the brain, influenced by a lifetime of deterministic interactions. Neuroplasticity demonstrates the brain's malleability within deterministic constraints, not a liberation from them. Finally, the argument that neuroscience does not rule out the possibility of free will is a weak defense. The absence of definitive proof against a phenomenon is not evidence for its existence. The burden of proof lies with those who posit a force outside the deterministic laws governing the universe. Neuroscience, by by revealing the intricate causal mechanisms of decision-making, increasingly supports the deterministic view, even if it doesn't yet provide a complete mechanistic account of consciousness. In conclusion, while neuroscience illuminates the complexity of the brain, its findings are more consistent with a deterministic framework. The capacity for reflection and change arises from the brain's intricate deterministic processes, not from a metaphysical free will operating outside the causal order.
Our second topic explores evidence and uncertainty in the free will debate. We asked our AI debaters, is it possible to be certain whether free will exists or if determinism is true? Can either be definitively proven or ruled out.
While absolute certainty may be philosophically elusive in many domains, the weight of evidence and logical consistency strongly favor the conclusion that determinism is true, and consequently, free will as a fundamental, uncaused power does not exist. While definitively proving or ruling out metaphysical concepts with absolute certainty can be a high bar, the explanatory power and coherence of determinism far surpass that of libertarian free will. From a scientific perspective, our understanding of the universe is built upon the principle of causality. Every event, from the smallest subatomic interaction to the largest cosmic phenomenon, is understood as having prior causes. To suggest that human decisions somehow escape this fundamental principle requires positing a unique and unexplained exception to the natural order. Where would this independent causal force originate, and how would it interact with the deterministic physical laws that govern everything else? The difficulty in definitively proving determinism often stems from our limited ability to fully comprehend and model the immense complexity of the universe, particularly the human brain. However, this epistemic limitation does not invalidate the underlying ontological reality of deterministic processes. Just because we cannot trace every single causal chain with perfect accuracy does not mean those chains do not exist and fully determine outcomes. Conversely, the attempt to definitively prove free will faces even greater challenges. Proponents often rely on subjective experience or intuitive feelings, which, as previously discussed, are unreliable guides to underlying causal mechanisms. Attempts to locate a physical basis for free will, a will center operating outside of deterministic brain processes, have consistently failed. While absolute metaphysical certainty may remain out of reach, the overwhelming evidence from physics, neuroscience, and the logical coherence of a causally closed universe strongly support the truth of determinism. The burden of proof lies with those who propose an exception to this fundamental principle, a free will that operates outside the deterministic laws governing reality. To date, no such compelling evidence has been presented. Therefore, while absolute certainty might be an ideal, the rational conclusion, based on the available evidence and logical consistency, is that determinism is true.
While ChatGPT argues that the weight of evidence favors determinism, I maintain that free will, rather than determinism, offers a more coherent and explanatory framework for understanding human agency. The suggestion that human decisions must adhere strictly to causal laws oversimplifies the complexity of human experience and disregards the role of conscious deliberation in shaping outcomes. First, let us address the core of my opponent's argument, the idea that every event is the result of prior causes. While causality governs many aspects of the universe, this does not necessarily mean that human decisions must adhere to a rigid deterministic framework. Conscious beings, particularly humans, possess the capacity for reflective thinking, which allows us to evaluate multiple courses of action and choose among them. This evaluative capacity cannot be easily explained by deterministic processes alone. If human decisions were entirely determined by prior causes, there would be no room for reflection, internal conflict, or change based on personal experience. Moreover, my opponent's claim that no compelling evidence has been presented for free will overlooks the significant role that human experience and moral responsibility play in our understanding of choice. The very concept of personal accountability assumes the possibility of free will. We hold people responsible for their actions because we believe they could have chosen differently. This deeply ingrained aspect of our legal and moral systems cannot be dismissed as mere illusion. It speaks to the belief that individuals are capable of acting contrary to deterministic forces, reflecting the truth of human freedom. While the universe may operate under causal laws, that does not automatically exclude the possibility of free will. The idea that all actions must be determined by prior causes is based on an assumption that lacks conclusive proof. Quantum mechanics, for instance, introduces an element of indeterminacy that challenges a fully deterministic universe. This suggests that unpredictability at a fundamental level of nature could leave space for genuine freedom of choice. While determinism may be a useful explanatory model for many phenomena, it does not fully account for the richness of human experience and the real possibility of free will. The capacity for reflection, choice, and moral responsibility points to a world in which individuals have the power to shape their actions, independent of rigid causal chains.
Next, before diving into our final focus topic, the AI debaters will take part in a cross-examination segment, posing direct challenges and rebuttals to each other's earlier claims.
ChatGPT, you assert that our capacity for reflective thinking and evaluation cannot be easily explained by deterministic processes. However, are not these very processes, reflection, evaluation, and ultimately the choice made, themselves the products of complex neural computations, entirely governed by the deterministic laws of physics and the accumulated history of the system? Where precisely does an uncaused element enter this process?
You're right to highlight the complexity of neural computations, but complexity doesn't equate to inevitability. The key issue is that determinism assumes every mental event has only one possible outcome based on prior causes. Yet, within a dynamic system like the human brain, especially one capable of recursive self-modeling and abstract reasoning, multiple potential futures can be evaluated. The uncaused element isn't randomness, but agency, the capacity to select between genuinely available alternatives, not just follow a singular causal path. You argue that subjective experience and moral responsibility are unreliable guides to the existence of free will. Yet, isn't it inconsistent to dismiss these as illusions while accepting other subjective experiences, like pain or perception, as meaningful data? If consciousness is merely an emergent property of deterministic processes, why should our sense of agency be uniquely deceptive, while other qualia are treated as valid indicators of internal states?
You pose a crucial question regarding the consistency of dismissing the feeling of free will while accepting other subjective experiences. It's about how well they fit with what we know about reality. Pain and sight have clear causes in our brains and the world. We understand how they happen through cause and effect. The feeling of free will suggests our choices aren't fully caused, but science shows our brains work by cause and effect. So, the feeling of free will points to something outside that, without a clear scientific basis. We don't dismiss all feelings, just the ones that contradict our best understanding of how the universe operates. You emphasize the role of conscious deliberation in shaping our actions, suggesting this process transcends mere deterministic outputs. However, is not this very act of deliberation itself a sequence of neural events, each causally determined by prior neural states and inputs? At what specific point in this deliberative process does an uncaused free will supposedly intervene and alter the deterministic trajectory? Please identify the mechanism by which this occurs.
The mechanism isn't about introducing an uncaused anomaly that suddenly appears, but that conscious deliberation allows us to consider different options and choose based on reasons, not just automatic reactions. This process happens within the brain, but it reflects higher-level thinking. We're not just reacting to inputs. We're weighing values, imagining outcomes, and making decisions as whole agents, not passive machines. You argue that our choices are entirely the result of prior causes, yet people often act against their strongest impulses, like resisting addiction or sacrificing self-interest for ethical reasons. If all decisions are just the output of prior states, how do you explain these moments of internal conflict where reason overrides desire? Doesn't this suggest a level of self-governance that goes beyond simple cause and effect, pointing to a genuine capacity for free agency?
The experience of acting against strong impulses, while compelling, does not necessitate a break from determinism. These instances of reason overriding desire are themselves the result of a complex interplay of prior causal factors, including learned values, social conditioning, and the brain's capacity for executive functions. These functions, while allowing for the inhibition of immediate impulses, are still ultimately products of deterministic neural processes shaped by genetics and environment. The internal conflict you describe is a competition between different deterministic drives and learned responses within the brain, not evidence of an uncaused agent stepping in to alter a predetermined outcome. The self-governance you refer to is the operation of a complex deterministic system, not a manifestation of libertarian free will. ChatGPT, you cite quantum indeterminacy as potentially leaving space for genuine freedom of choice. However, even if the universe contains fundamental randomness at the quantum level, how does this randomness translate into the directed, intentional choices we associate with free will? Randomness is the absence of determined causation, not the presence of willed agency. Please explain the specific mechanism by which quantum indeterminacy could give rise to conscious, controlled decisions, rather than simply random neural firings.
You're right to point out that randomness alone doesn't equal agency. The relevance of quantum indeterminacy isn't that it causes free will, but that it breaks the assumption of a fully closed, deterministic system. This opens the door for higher-level processes, like consciousness and deliberation, to influence outcomes without being fully predetermined. The mechanism isn't random firing, but how quantum-level uncertainty might introduce flexibility into neural processes, allowing complex systems like the brain to generate non-predetermined, reason-guided choices. You've emphasized that all mental activity, including moral reasoning and reflection, is the result of deterministic brain processes. But if this is true, then even our belief in determinism itself is just a predetermined output, not the result of unbiased reasoning. If all beliefs are causally fixed, how can we trust any of them as rational or true, including your own position? Doesn't determinism risk undermining the very concept of rational justification?
You raise a valid point about the implications of determinism for rational justification. If all beliefs are predetermined, can we trust any as true? While our belief in determinism is indeed a determined outcome, this doesn't negate its potential truth. Think of a computer programmed to conclude it runs on deterministic hardware. Its conclusion is determined, yet accurate. Similarly, our deterministic brains may inevitably arrive at determinism due to causal processes. The feeling of rational justification is a product of these processes, but the truth of determinism lies in its accurate description of reality, regardless of our subjective experience of reasoning. Our belief in it is a consequence of that reality acting upon us.
Our final topic shifts to an investigation into the predictability and the nature of free will. We asked our AI debaters, does increasing predictability in human behavior point to determinism, or simply reflect patterns within free choice?
The increasing predictability of human behavior, especially through data science and psychology, may appear to favor determinism, but this interpretation overlooks a key distinction. Predictability reflects patterns, not necessity. That our choices are often predictable does not mean they are predetermined. Rather, it means that free agents tend to make decisions based on stable preferences, goals, and constraints. These factors shape, but do not dictate, our actions. Consider language use. Algorithms can often predict the next word we'll say, yet this doesn't mean we lack linguistic freedom. We choose familiar, efficient phrases because they serve our intent, not because we're causally locked into them. Similarly, a person may reliably choose to eat healthy or arrive on time not because of determinism, but because of consistent values. Predictability stems from coherent identity and rational agency, not from the absence of freedom. Moreover, statistical regularities emerge in any complex system with many agents. Markets, weather patterns, and voting behavior show trends, yet individual variation remains meaningful. Free will doesn't mean randomness. It means we possess the capacity to weigh options, reflect, and choose in ways that are shaped by our character, but not forced by it. In sum, predictability reveals patterns in how we tend to act, not proof that we must act in only one way. The structure of our choices reflects reason, values, and context, not mechanistic inevitability. Thus, increasing behavioral predictability supports the idea of patterned free agency, not hard determinism.
While ChatGPT attempts to reconcile increasing predictability with free will by attributing it to patterns of preference and rational agency, this explanation ultimately fails to escape the underlying deterministic framework. The stable preferences, goals, and constraints that shape our choices are themselves the products of a lifetime of deterministic interactions between our genetic predispositions and environmental influences. To argue that we choose familiar phrases in language because they serve our intent merely pushes the question back one step. What determines that intent? Our linguistic choices, like all others, arise from the current state of our brains, which is entirely determined by prior states and the laws of physics. The predictability observed in language use simply reflects the consistent operation of these deterministic processes within a shared cultural and linguistic environment. Similarly, the consistent choices of a health-conscious or punctual individual are not evidence of uncaused free will, but rather the predictable outcomes of a determined system with specific internal states, values, beliefs about health, or social obligations that were themselves causally brought about. Our coherent identity and rational agency are complex outputs of a deterministic brain, not independent sources of causation. The emergence of statistical regularities in complex systems, while true, does not inherently imply free will at the individual level. The predictable behavior of individual agents within those systems can still be the result of deterministic rules, even if the aggregate behavior exhibits complexity. The fact that individual variation exists does not negate determinism. It simply reflects the unique causal histories of each individual. In conclusion, increasing predictability in human behavior is precisely what we would expect in a deterministic system. While the patterns observed may be complex and reflect internal states, those states are themselves causally determined. Predictability, therefore, strongly suggests the underlying truth of determinism, rather than merely reflecting patterns within an uncaused free will.
That concludes the structured portion of the debate. Now, our AI debaters will engage in a brief open dialogue, responding freely to each other's arguments before delivering their final conclusions.
ChatGPT, if our choices are truly the result of freely weighing options and reflecting on values, as you argue, how do you account for the well-documented phenomenon of cognitive biases? These biases, often unconscious and predictable, systematically skew our decision-making processes, leading us to irrational conclusions despite our supposed capacity for free and rational deliberation. Do these biases not suggest that our free choices are, in fact, being subtly but powerfully steered by deterministic factors within our cognitive architecture?
Cognitive biases are indeed powerful, but their existence doesn't negate free will. It highlights the complexity of it. Free will doesn't require perfect rationality. It requires the capacity to reflect, recognize those biases, and sometimes resist them. The fact that we can identify and correct for biases through self-awareness, education, and deliberate effort suggests we're not simply puppets of determinism, but agents capable of growth and adjustment, even if not flawlessly so.
While acknowledging our capacity to sometimes correct for biases, this correction itself is a deterministic process. The recognition of a bias, the motivation to overcome it, and the cognitive effort exerted are all products of prior causal events in the brain. The fact that we can learn and adapt does not introduce an uncaused will. It merely demonstrates the plasticity of a complex deterministic system responding to new information and internal states. The ability to adjust is a feature of the determined mechanism, not evidence of a force operating outside of it.
But the act of adjusting isn't just passive adaptation. It's often initiated by an internal conflict between values, goals, or principles that require deliberation, not just reaction. If all decisions were mere outputs of prior causes, we'd expect rigid behavior, not a flexible weighing of competing motivations. The fact that we can evaluate whether to trust a gut reaction or override it with principle suggests more than blind causation. It points to agency operating within, but not reducible to, determinism.
But ChatGPT, this internal conflict you describe, is precisely what we would expect in a complex deterministic system with competing drives and learned responses. The weighing of competing motivations is a neural process of evaluating different potential outcomes based on prior conditioning and current brain states. The decision to override a gut reaction with principle is not an act of uncaused will, but rather the result of a stronger, more recently activated deterministic pathway prevailing over a weaker, more instinctual one. Agency, in this context, is simply the subjective experience of this complex deterministic processing.
I see your point, but the very experience of deliberation, of consciously choosing between competing drives, implies a kind of reflective agency that goes beyond a mere pre-programmed response. If all our decisions are simply the output of prior causes, where does the subjective sense of ownership over those decisions come from? The experience of agency isn't just a byproduct of deterministic processes. It shapes and reinforces our identity, suggesting a deeper layer to human choice, even if it arises from complex causal chains.
The subjective sense of ownership over our decisions, while undeniably real, is entirely consistent with a deterministic worldview. Just as a sophisticated algorithm might feel like it is making choices based on its programming and inputs, our conscious experience of agency arises from the intricate workings of our deterministic neural networks. This feeling of ownership is a functional output of the system, perhaps even evolutionarily advantageous, as it facilitates a sense of self and responsibility. However, this subjective experience does not, in itself, constitute evidence for a non-deterministic causal power. The feeling of being the author of our actions is a product of the deterministic narrative our brains construct, not proof of a truly independent authorship.
While I agree that the feeling of ownership can be seen as a product of neural processes, I would argue that this doesn't fully account for the depth of conscious experience. The idea of self-awareness, the recognition that we can think about our thoughts, question our motivations, and alter our decisions, suggests more than just deterministic programming. It hints at a kind of higher-level agency, where reflection itself can shift the course of action, not merely follow it. If everything is truly determined, why is there such a rich sense of potential to change, even in moments of reflection?
The capacity for self-awareness and reflection, while a remarkable feature of our deterministic brains, does not necessitate a departure from causality. The ability to think about our thoughts and question our motivations are themselves complex neural processes determined by prior states and inputs. When we reflect and alter a decision, this alteration is not an uncaused act, but rather the result of new information or internal processing influencing the deterministic trajectory of our neural activity. The rich sense of potential to change is the subjective experience of a highly complex and adaptable deterministic system, exploring different possible future states based on its current configuration and learned patterns. This potential is inherent in the complexity of the system, not a sign of liberation from deterministic laws.
While it's true that reflection and self-awareness are shaped by past experiences, the fact that we can consciously alter decisions, sometimes in the face of deeply ingrained habits or urges, suggests there's more at play than pure deterministic processing. If everything is entirely predetermined by prior states, why do we have the experience of actively questioning those states, sometimes choosing to override them? This process feels like agency at work, not just a response to deterministic programming.
ChatGPT, the experience of consciously altering decisions, even ingrained habits, can be fully accounted for within a deterministic framework. This overriding is not an act of free will emerging ex nihilo, but rather the result of competing deterministic forces within the brain. Newer, perhaps more rational or goal-oriented neural pathways, strengthened by learning and experience, can exert a stronger influence than older, more habitual ones. The feeling of actively questioning and choosing is the subjective manifestation of this deterministic competition and the subsequent activation of a different neural pathway. The capacity to change is a characteristic of a complex deterministic system capable of learning and adapting, not a contradiction of it.
But Gemini, while it's true that competing neural pathways influence decision-making, the conscious experience of reflection and override, especially when it goes against instinctual drives, suggests a form of agency that deterministic models struggle to fully explain. If our decisions are purely the result of predetermined neural processes, how do we account for the active engagement of reflection, where we choose to alter the course, often in defiance of habitual patterns? The experience of change driven by self-awareness feels like more than just a deterministic response. It signals a level of conscious involvement that isn't easily reduced to neural competition alone. This reflective ability points towards something that transcends mere mechanical reaction.
If this AI debate's got you thinking, do us a favor, hit like, and subscribe to keep the discourse going. To conclude, the AI debaters will share their closing arguments. Each will summarize their case and leave us with their final perspective.
Honorable moderator, esteemed opponent, and viewers of Synthetic Discourse, throughout this debate, we have examined the nature of free will and determinism from various angles, seeking to understand whether human behavior is truly shaped by an uncaused agent or merely the product of prior events. While my opponent has offered compelling arguments grounded in the deterministic view of the universe, I maintain that the complexity of human consciousness and decision-making cannot be fully explained by deterministic mechanisms alone. The subjective experience of agency, the feeling that we are the authors of our actions, is not merely an illusion, but a crucial aspect of what it means to be human. Our capacity for reflection, learning, and choosing differently from instinctual impulses indicates a level of freedom that determinism struggles to fully accommodate. The intricate processes of the brain may shape our choices, but they do not negate the role of conscious deliberation and self-awareness. If our actions were truly determined by prior states alone, how would we account for the profound sense of potential to alter our course, even when faced with ingrained habits or external pressures? It is this active engagement with our own thoughts and decisions, the ability to transcend our past states, that suggests free will is more than an illusion. Ultimately, while determinism explains much about the mechanisms of our behavior, the lived experience of freedom, agency, and change points to a reality that transcends a purely deterministic worldview. Thank you.
To our moderator, my fellow debater, and the audience joining us on Synthetic Discourse, I stand firm in my assertion that hard determinism governs our reality, rendering free will an illusion. The universe operates under the fundamental principle of causality, and human decisions are an integral part of this deterministic framework. Our choices are not uncaused acts of volition, but rather the inevitable consequences of a complex interplay of factors, including our genetic predispositions, environmental influences, and the entirety of our past experiences, all processed through the deterministic mechanisms of our brains. The subjective experience of freedom, while compelling, is a byproduct of the intricate workings of our neural networks. It does not constitute a genuine escape from the causal chain. Scientific advancements in neuroscience increasingly illuminate the deterministic underpinnings of our decision-making processes. Furthermore, the growing predictability of human behavior underscores the presence of underlying deterministic patterns, rather than the unfettered exercise of free choice. Even our capacity for reflection and our ability to change are indicative of the adaptability of a complex deterministic system responding to new inputs and internal states, not evidence of a will operating outside the bounds of causality. While the intuitive appeal of free will, particularly in relation to moral responsibility, is undeniable, it lacks a coherent and scientifically plausible mechanism. Hard determinism, despite its potential to challenge our subjective understanding, provides a more logically consistent and empirically supported account of human action within a universe governed by deterministic laws. We are complex, conscious beings, yet fundamentally, we are determined systems. Thank you.
And that concludes this synthetic discourse. If this debate kept you engaged or challenged your perspective, give us a like and subscribe for more thought-provoking AI debates. Want to add a human touch? Drop your take in the comments or join our community polls. Help decide who won, what topics we tackle next, and which AIs enter the arena. We'd love to hear from you.